So we'll get started to keep everyone on time. So we're here to talk about AWS Config. So if that's the session you're looking for, you're in the right place. So my name is Jarrid Kleinfelter. I'm a solutions architect at AWS. I've been at AWS for a little over 5 years. So my day-to-day, I support insurance customers as a solution architect, but then I'm also a part of our cloud operations specialty practice. So I talk to a wide range of customers across different industries about things like control tower, governance, AWS config. And one of the things that comes up often is how do I get the most out of AWS config to manage my resources, and why does it cost so much? So that's kind of what we're gonna talk about here in this session. So we'll go through. We'll start with what is AWS config. I mean, if you've used it, you're probably already familiar with it, but we'll talk about what AWS config can actually do. We'll talk about the pricing components, because that is a big part of config. Is I turned it on and all of a sudden I got this huge bill. Why? Right. So we'll talk about how that pricing is calculated, and then we'll talk more about configuration items and resource management and different ways you can aggregate that, because if you have one account, not a big deal, but most users of AWS have lots of accounts, or you might even have an AWS organization with hundreds of accounts. So we'll talk about ways of actually aggregating and leveraging that data across a wide range of accounts. And then we'll talk about that cost optimization piece that I mentioned. So to start out, so what is AWS config? I mean, AWS config is all about capturing and maintaining state of your resources in AWS. And so resource, it could be a Lambda function, it could be a security group, it could be an EC2 instance, right? You have lots of resources. In the past, and you had on-prem prior to cloud, you might have had, servers, virtual, physical, some networking equipment. It was kind of manageable. You might have had a CMDB or something like that. But once you get into the cloud, the number of resources just explodes exponentially, and you have a lot that you have to maintain. So config, again, first part of that is actually capturing state changes to your resources. So that's kind of its one job. And the other is maintaining that state. So I can build a set of rules, things like that, to actually say if this resource state has gone out of bounds and done something that I didn't want, then I can take action on that. So fundamentally, that's kind of what AWS config is all about. And then you can send that data off to various places. So you can see here's a couple of them. And you can send alerts and notifications. So if that resource state has gone out of bounds, I want to get a notification for that. I can do SNS notifications, for example. S3, like I can send all this configuration data into a centralized location in S3, and then I can access it at that scale across my organization. That's what we'll talk about a little bit more here in a bit. So understanding the pricing, because again, that's the thing that often comes up. So there's two main sort of categories of pricing for config. So one is configuration items. So what is that? So every time I have a resource and it undergoes a state change, I'm going to record that. That's a configuration item. And you pay for every one of those configuration items that gets recorded. So it could be if it's something you created, you changed, you deleted. So anytime a resource undergoes a state change. It's also relationship changes. So if I have two resources, let's say a security group and something else, and I attach that security group, I didn't necessarily change the configuration of that security group, but I created a new relationship because I attached it to a Lambda function or whatever, something, an EC2 instance. So those are also captured as well. There's different ways, so continuous or periodic recording. So we'll talk about that in the cost optimization once we get into that. Like, when do you use each of those? When does it make sense? So configuration items, that's one side of the cost equation. Rule evaluations is the other category or bucket of where you see cost and config. So every time I have a resource undergo a change, I want to evaluate that against a set of rules that I've created to make sure that I'm maintaining a consistent state or a configuration that I allow, right? So those rule evaluations, again, every time a rule evaluates a resource, that's a cost element for it. And then there's also conformance packs. So think of conformance packs as sort of collections of rules. And so there's a different sort of pricing scheme for that. But largely, this is where you would see cost. Now, when I talk to customers that say, why is config costing me so much? It's typically on the configuration items. It's usually not because they have too many rules out there. It's mostly because of what they're recording. So we'll talk, for the rest of this, we're going to really focus on the configuration items. So, I mentioned part of config is kind of recording the state changes. So how do you start to leverage this, and how do you analyze these configuration items? Well, if you're in one account in AWS, it's probably not that big of a deal, right? You have your account, you can go into config, you can explore your resources, and you can kind of manage it. But as you start to grow and you have multiple accounts, hundreds of accounts, you're probably going to want some kind of centralized visibility to your resources. And one way to do that is with config aggregators. So when you're creating your config deployment, you can say, I want to designate an account to be the aggregate account. So it's going to record all those resource configuration items, but it's going to send that into a centralized location. So now you can get visibility across your whole organization, right? So if you're a cloud platform engineering team or an operations team, this is great because now you can see what everybody's doing, right? So really simple, across accounts, cross regions, it's going to send all that config data into one central location using the aggregator. And then there's some built-in components within the account where you have that aggregator. So you get a centralized dashboard. You got compliance dashboards. You can actually do some kind of basic querying on that configuration data. So you get decent visibility. But you're really viewing the current snapshot of data. So oftentimes what comes up is, well, how do I look at history of my configuration across the organization, right? And that's where it gets a little bit more challenging. So another component is delivery channels. So when you're creating your configuration, you can say, I want to send all of these recordings into a central location. In this case, I'm going to send them into an S3 bucket. So again, I can do that across multiple accounts. I can do it across multiple regions. And once that data is in that S3 bucket, it's going to be partitioned. It's going to be organized for you. And then I can start using tools like Athena to run actual SQL queries against this data. Gives you a much more powerful tool to analyze these resources. Plus, you've got history. So now you're just putting that data in S3. You can decide how long you want to retain that configuration history, right? So what does it look like? So this is an example. If you're not familiar with Athena, it's a managed query engine. It's based on Trino under the covers. It used to be Presto. So you can run SQL, but you have a whole library of pretty powerful functions that you can use with Athena as well. So things like, when you get a configuration item stored in S3, it's going to look like the table at the top. That's just an example of what one record looks like. So there's going to be some header data, which account was this resource in, what was the region, what was the timestamp that the configuration was recorded. And then there's going to be this sort of big JSON element, which is the configuration state, right? So if you actually want to start to dive into the configuration, one way you can do that with Athena is you can basically unnest that JSON, and now you explode those out into individual columns. So on this, you can see the ARN, right? I can get configuration item.ARN. So now I have access to the ARN within that configuration, the configuration item. Resource types, configuration state ID. So there's all kinds of information that represents the configuration of that resource that you can explode out into individual columns. Once you do that, and you've sort of unnested that JSON, now you're just writing SQL at that point. So you can do all the things that you're familiar with. You can do counts and group bys and order bys and stuff like that. So why would you need to do this? So these are real world questions that I've had my customers ask me that have been solved by using this solution. So one was, they wanted to know how many times the security groups have been modified in the last year, and that was across all of their, hundreds of accounts. And the reason was they felt that their application teams weren't really managing their security groups very well, and they were doing it by trial and error. Like making a change, test it, make a change, test it. And so not a great way to manage security. So they wanted some data that says, here's all my security groups, here's the number of times that it's been changed, and go back all year. That's something that you could get by using Athena and these delivery channels. Another one, how many configuration changes have my Lambda functions undergone? So, again, the question here was, I think my teams are just deploying constantly. They're not really testing, they're throwing things out there. How do I tell how often they're changing their Lambda functions, right? So that was a way you could do it. And you can see some of the other ones, if you want to say, what did my resources look like 3 months ago versus today? You can get that very easy. Another one was, how do I see of all the resources in my organization, what's the coverage for infrastructure as code? So I could say, how many resources have been created that don't have the CloudFormation tags associated with those. So these are just examples. I mean, you could probably come up with many other examples of types of questions that you've been asked. Usually it's, a senior leader or somebody's asking you this question. Now you can actually give them answers pretty quickly. Does anybody have a question that they recently thought somebody asked them? Any ideas? Anything people could think of? So in this case, because you're putting it in an S3 bucket, it's whatever your lifecycle policy is on that bucket, right? So you can keep it as long as you want. Yeah. Cool. So let's talk about cost optimization. So this is usually the next question after they're like, okay, config sounds good, I'm going to turn it on, and suddenly they get a bill, right? And they're like, why was there a cost spike? So the quick answer when you turn it on is because config is going to do an initial recording of all of your resources, right? So it's got to get a baseline state map of everything. So it's going to go out and do a recording. So suddenly now you've thousands or hundreds of thousands of resources, you've recorded the state of all of them at once, you're going to get a big spike, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other is, as you start to go through, how often are your resources changing? You might have ephemeral type resources, auto-scaling groups, where you're adding and subtracting instances to an auto-scaling group, right? Every time it's added and removed, you're going to get configuration state changes. I had one customer that they had auto-scaling groups, and then they had instance scheduler, and they were fighting each other. So they would auto-scale something up, instance scheduler had a rule to shut them down, auto-scaling group would say, now you don't have enough instances, it would scale it up. And so this was happening, and so the way they actually discovered it was their config costs started to go up, which led them back to figuring out what they had.
So configuration changes.
Yeah. So recording the state change, the configuration item, which is the state change of that configuration, recording that there's a cost element to that. Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So you can there's continuous recording, which means every time it changes, you're going to record it. There's also periodic recording. So you can say, I only want to record it once a day. And so there's some pros and cons, but I have that here in a slide or two. So how do you start to analyze this, right? You got this cost, you got over the initial hump, and now you see that config's still costing you too much. So the first place you can go is into CloudWatch. And so there's CloudWatch metrics that you get by default when you turn on config that will start to tell you which resource types are being recorded. And you can do group by right within a CloudWatch dashboard. You can do a group by and do a count and sort it. So you can say, here's the largest number of recordings I have by resource type. So that'll give you a hint why, what's changing so often and what's driving up the cost. So once you've discovered these are the resource types that are costing me the most, you can, one option is you could take a sledgehammer and you could just exclude that resource type. Probably not what you want to do because you probably still want the data. But one option is like if you don't care about a particular resource type, you can just completely exclude it, and you'll no longer record the configuration changes for that, right? So that cost would go away. Here's the other one. So the periodic recording. So this is probably more useful. So periodic recording would record, say, like once a day. So it's going to take a snapshot of that resource once a day, and it's going to record it at that point in time. So the positive side there is you're only incurring one configuration item recording cost per day for that resource. The trade-off is if that resource changes frequently throughout the day, you don't get every one of those incremental state changes. You just get, the final one at the end of the day. So again, it's a decision point you have to make. Are you okay just getting a snapshot once a day, or do you need every single state change over time? And you can do this. You can set this by resource type. You can be pretty granular with this to set specific resources. So a lot of options on how you can control how often things are recorded. Another one, this one, often you'll see a resource type called resource compliance, and it's often number one. When you look at those CloudWatch metrics and you group it, it'll be the top, and people, they don't know what it is because there is no resource that you spun up called resource compliance. Resource compliance is actually something that config itself uses. So within config, there is a history view. So if you're in an individual account, there's a history view that you can look at that shows the changes to one particular resource over time. The resource compliance resource type is actually what is used to keep track of that. So if you can think, every time my resource changes, I'm recording the state change, but I'm also recording the resource compliance of that resource at the same time. So if that's not something you're interested in, like you're not interested in the history view within the console, this is a resource type that you could then go exclude. So this is an example where you might just want to exclude this resource type entirely, right? If you are interested in seeing the historical views within the UI, then you would have to keep this resource type recording. So just to kind of recap, like key takeaways. So, configuration items, it's really about giving you visibility to the state of all of your AWS resources. Athena is talked about it, right? Powerful query engine that you can use to analyze those configuration items. You can use config itself. You can run queries in config, but it's not really a full SQL language. It doesn't have full SQL language support, right? So if you want to use SQL, you want to use all of the functions that you're familiar with, then you can use something like Athena. Also, like I said, you got all those powerful functions. You can unnest the JSON. You can do all the fancy things that you would do with JSON, in addition to just straight SQL as well. Cost excluding global resources. So this is another one. So because there's certain global resources, things like IAM roles, IAM policies, those are global in nature, so you really don't need to record them in every region. So just set a specific region for those. Again, you can use those exclusion rules and things that I talked about for that. Using CloudWatch, identify those most costly contributors to your cost based on resource type. And consider, like when you're deciding what you want to exclude, just be thoughtful, because if you do turn them off, now you don't have that history. You're not recording the state changes, so you don't have that data, or that you don't have that history to go back and look at.